But even today, to me, this is amazing that even with all these war crimes going on in the occupied territories, Palestinian occupied territories, there's still a great many people who side with Israel. Yes, with Israel, and they either are completely uninformed of what is happening, or they don't want to see it.
Today I had the true privilege of sitting down with Nikolaos van Dam, a former Dutch ambassador and career diplomat. But first, an urgent message. Have you noticed how the voices speaking truth to power are getting harder to find? That's no accident. This channel is one of the few that dares to bring you unfiltered, hard-hitting political interviews, and because of this, we have been shadow banned. How do we know? Well, because of YouTube's own creator statistics and thanks to a growing number of viewer comments like these. But there is something you could do. Get involved with just 2 or 3 clicks. When you subscribe, like and hit the bell button, you're not just clicking some buttons. You're making a stand for free speech and independent thought. Your actions are crucial in helping us breaking through the barriers of the mighty YouTube algorithm and to reach more critical minds like yours. And if you haven't yet explored our previous interviews, you're missing out on some of the most revealing and insightful conversations available. Our archives include whistleblowers like John Kiriakou, who risk it all to expose systematic torture in CIA prison camps, diplomatic mavericks like the US ambassadors Charles Freeman and Jack Matlock, or the Dutch ambassador Nikolaos van Dam, and activists like the so-called Hamas lawyer Stanley Cohen or Ken O'Keefe, the former US Marine who, with his bare hands, disarmed 2 Israeli commandos whilst they shot and killed 10 people on the Gaza Freedom Flotilla in 2010. But now enough of this. Let's sit back and enjoy another powerful interview that challenges the status quo. Ambassador Nikolaos van Dam, how are you?
Very well, thank you. How are you?
Now that I have you on, I'm very pleased. Yeah, I was really looking forward to this conversation for a number of reasons, and I have to say, the more I did my research into you, basically, the more intrigued I became. Yeah. Now I have to say, I was a bit surprised that there are hardly any interviews from you in the Western world. But you are a fluent Arab speaker, so I saw many interviews on Arab channels, but also in Arab countries. Yeah. So why, maybe we start with that just as a warm up. Yeah. Why do you think there is so little voice of you, let's say in the Netherlands and in the Western world in general?
Well, I think there are several interviews in the Netherlands and Dutch TV, Dutch radio, quite a lot.
Yeah.
One might say that in Germany I could have had quite a lot of interviews as well. But at that time, I think there was some restrictions talking about Germany, Dutch-German relations. Actually, I also had some interviews with Dutch media on Germany, mainly written. Some sensitive issues even, but it was but because my expertise is, of course, the Middle East, the Arab world, and some Arab countries I know more about than others. I think I know most about Syria than Palestine. Iraq has also been a great interest to me, and what I realized is that if you know of one subject a lot, you realize much more that about other subjects you know less, so you have to be more modest. But in the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, there was a system of generalism, which means if you have some general knowledge, you could be placed anywhere in the world. But in fact, expertise is, of course, extremely important. But so I know where I have more liberty to speak, more reason, more authority, so to say, to speak than on other subjects. So perhaps, well, my interest is the Middle East much more than Europe, so I don't have I have, of course, a lot to say, but I don't say it because I don't consider myself an expert on those subjects. That's the main reason.
Understood. And I have a couple of notes in front of me here. So if I have this correctly collected, yeah, you were stationed in, and I'm not entirely sure, stationed or ambassador, right? In Iraq, Egypt, Germany, Indonesia, Turkey, Azerbaijan. You were the Dutch special envoy for Syria from 2015, 2016. Did I leave anything out? And of course, yeah, please.
I was also posted in Lebanon, and from there I covered also the Jordan and the West Bank, of the Palestinian occupied West Bank, and even Cyprus. And afterwards I was chargé d'affaires in Libya in the time of Gaddafi.
Libya. When were you in Lebanon?
I was in Lebanon for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in between 1980 and 1983. So one of the most important moments was the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982.
That's why I'm asking. Amazing. Yeah.
And I also lived in Lebanon in 1974, 75, but then I was working on my PhD thesis on Syria.
Yeah. I just wanted to mention it. So you're not only just a diplomat, yeah, you're also an established academic. So you studied Arabic language. I said already you're fluent in Arabic, political science, and social sciences at the University of Amsterdam. Graduated with cum laude. Congratulations!
Well, thank you.
PhD, etc., etc. You have a number of publications. I see here, and quite some on Syria. Yeah. The struggle for power in Syria, destroying a nation, and you have a number of books. Let me count, 6 or 7 books, right? 3, 4 of them on Syria. The last one from 2020, Grenades and Minarets, if I translate this correctly. Yeah?
Yes, and the subtitle is perhaps even certainly more important. The subtitle is translated to English, A Diplomat in Search for Peace in the Arab and Islamic World.
This memoir recounts Van Dam's experiences and efforts to mediate peace in the turbulent regions in the Middle East. Yeah,
that's right.
Okay, so really, I think that makes you special, right? So as an academically trained diplomat who has spent, I believe, most of your career, right, in the Middle East. Yeah,
that's right. That's right.
Coming back to what you said, authority. So I believe, from my perspective, you have more than sufficient authority to speak on these topics.
Thank you. Well, I think actually I wanted to have an academic career. I mean, not career, but being in university in science. But just by accident, I ended up in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I never regretted it because I could combine my academic interests with being posted in the countries I was interested in. And that does not apply to everyone because I have not been, let's say, posted in Latin America and then somewhere in East Asia and then in North Pole, South Pole and so on. But generally, if not always, in countries I was very much interested in. And I think, as I mentioned perhaps before, it's very important to be really well informed about the countries which you are working in order to report in a substantial way to your ministry, to your minister.
Very briefly, just out of personal curiosity, how does one become, coincidentally, a diplomat?
Well, at the time when I returned from Lebanon, where I was doing my PhD research in 1975, there was simply no job for me in the University of Amsterdam, and so that's why I applied for a job in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and that's how I got there. And so this was fortunate. There are not always places in the university, or neither in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So I was lucky in that sense, because in the end, from my perspective, it's nicer to be in those countries you're interested in than to be behind your desk somewhere in a room in a university. Although these days, university people are much more going to the countries which are interested in.
Yeah. Now, a couple of days ago, I think, what is today? Today is Wednesday. I think last Thursday, it's almost a week ago, yeah. There came this last ICG ruling out, which condemns Israel's presence and violation of Israel's presence and violation of international law in Palestine. So there were also these attempts from, I forgot his name, I had it on a different interview, the head of the Mossad trying to personally intimidate the chief judge of either ICC or ICG,
Yes.
which she then made public. So what does that say in general terms about Israel's position at the moment?
Well, in the first place, what the ICG decided or declared was known for tens of years. So there's, in that respect, very little new. I would not have needed a court to know what has been going on for perhaps a century already. But if I count from the establishment from Israel in 1948, then 76 years. This Mossad story just shows that Israel behind the scenes is trying to influence all kinds of things. And this happened not only in the ICG, but in other places, like, for instance, Corbyn in Great Britain. He was also, I think, prevented from getting his position by Israel. There's a whole, this is the so-called Israel lobby. If you say something, or if you report something, there's a whole group of people who are then trying to criticize you, or it's framing to put you in a bad position for other people. And I think in the modern democracies, or so-called democracies, the media are more important than in the past, because in the past there were media, but I mean, they were not accessible as they are today. So this says about that the Israelis are having a great influence also in the United States, for instance, in particular in the United States, like AIPAC. And in the Netherlands, we have also such an organization, CD, and other groups. So they are generally having great influence. So it's not about objective facts. It's about perception. But even today, to me, this is amazing that even with all these war crimes going on in the occupied territories, Palestinian occupied territories, there's still a great many people who side with Israel. With Israel, and they either are completely uninformed of what is happening, or they don't want to see it. And also in Israel itself, people are not that much aware. They could be aware, but about what's happening and what they're doing to the Palestinians because of their media. Media usually write or publish things which the audience wants to hear. Because let's just say, if a newspaper, if it publishes things which the people don't want to hear, then they simply cut off their subscriptions. So there's a kind of imbalance, and to change things, you can only media can operate not radically, but they have to operate gradually. But if it works out that they lose, then they will not do so. So this is influenced by behind the scenes enormously for a long time. And even in 1967, I thought things would greatly change. Well, there has been a great change. All information is in principle available through books, also through papers, but it doesn't translate, at least not in the Netherlands and certainly not in the United States. It doesn't translate into practical changes in policies.
There's a lot of things to unpack what you just said. Yeah, one of which is the Israel lobby, right? So that's indeed, I mean, we don't have to go into detail, yeah, but that was a really, really interesting documentary from Al Jazeera. You might know it. It's called The Lobby. It's about 4 years ago, where they went actually undercover. Al Jazeera went undercover in AIPAC.
Yes.
And then AIPAC tried to recruit the undercover journalist for their purposes, and this is all recorded. I mean, it's just too crazy to be, you know. Again, it's free, available on YouTube. It's from Al Jazeera. It's called The Lobby, or the Israel Lobby. I think it's called The Lobby, yeah, and 2 or 3 hours long, yeah. So it shows an inside view of how the lobby operates.
Yes, I've seen. I think I've seen a part of it when they, in a cafe, they discuss how they will topple Corbyn and such a thing.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. But where I really want to go with this is, and I don't know if you know them. I interviewed both Miko Pet and his sister, Professor Pet Elhanan. So the grandfather of Miko and Nurit was a co-signatory of Israel's Charter of Independence. And his father, or their father, was a general in the 1967 war. And after the war, he said, you know, we won and now we need peace, which is why he was kind of deposed. Yeah.
Yes.
Now, Miko is a very outspoken activist, and Professor Pet Elhanan is a Israeli scholar, and she investigated racism in Israeli school books. Yeah. So, and she found that from very early age on, almost after kindergarten, the Israelis are themselves already indoctrinated in a way that presents to them the Arabs as, I don't want to say already dehumanized, yeah, but as you know, dirty on a camel in a dirty village and so forth, yeah. But if they depict Israel, it's almost like a Swiss village, yeah. So that's why I'm saying the Israelis themselves are the first victims of their own propaganda.
Well, in general, what they reproach others from doing, they're doing themselves, and generally multiple. So, for instance, in these school books, they complain about school books by UNRWA. I'm not very familiar with it, but I mean, I would think it's quite normal that if you're being occupied, that you don't like your occupiers. You may even hate them, or you will. Most probably, it would be strange if you would not hate them. And if this occupation takes, for the Netherlands, was 5 years, but for the Palestinians, it's over 75 years. And actually, it started already before, in the 20s, also, that the Arabs in Palestine and elsewhere, they were protesting against the British policy to carry out the Balfour Declaration. And actually, I once attended a lecture by an Israeli parliamentarian, and he read to us the first 18 words. He said, I'm going to read now the first 18 words of the Balfour Declaration. But he didn't read the next part, and the latter part says that, in fact, comes down to the following, that there should be a national, or that the British, they encouraged the establishment of a national home for the Jews in Palestine, but the existing 5 or 10% should take account of the 19%, the 90. But they never did, and the British allowed them not to do it during the British Mandate. So this is one example how they first, you know, the cuckoo's nest. They lay an egg in a nest, and then the bird, it kicks out all the other eggs and then stays in itself. This happened in Palestine, more or less.
That's virtually true. That's virtually true. I mean, we have letters from former Arab population who lived in Palestine, who took on in their own houses Jewish refugees, and whilst the Jewish refugees were living in Arab houses, they were already writing letters home how to get rid of the Arabs from the land.
Yes. One big difference, I think, between Arabs and Jews in general in this situation is that the Arabs, they are very famous for hospitality. And I think this is true in general. Of course, some may say that there is usually some interest. Well, this applies to some people. Of course, they invite you and want something back. But in general, it is without any, it's a tradition. But the Jews, they want to help one another. So they want their children to play preferably with Jews. They want to go to the Jewish doctor, to the Jewish bakery, and so on. So they help one another. So in Palestine, what happened, once they got some territory, they would employ only other Jews in order to, in the final situation, to have a country for Jews only. So one of the examples. Under the Nazis, it was nicht für Juden, not for Jews. And in the Israeli Jewish frame, it is nur für Juden, for Jews only. And this happens all the time. So, and the strange thing is that it's fully condoned. Not fully condoned, but I mean, in general, the West, whatever Israel does, it gets away with it thus far. But perhaps not, I don't think, forever.
You said two very important things. Yeah, it's condoned, and then you said in the Western world, which is true. Yeah, so our Western world, let's say NATO-ish, yeah, this little bubble, which is like 16% of the world population. In our media, it seems like the whole world agrees with us or with Israel. Yeah, but if you watch the news in other countries, as I know you do, the picture, especially in the global South, is completely different.
Completely different, but also, I think, among the population in the West, Western countries, the population has changed as far as composition is concerned. So, for instance, in the Netherlands, there are many people from Moroccan origin, nowadays Syrian origin, or Afghan refugees or migrants. And they have not this so-called conscience that they should in any way feel guilty about what happened to the Jews. This is also another thing that, but that's another subject. So they don't have this burden. So they earlier feel this great injustice what is done to the Palestinians. It had nothing to do with Arabs or Jews, but it has to do with suppression and violation of the most basic rights.
It's also a generational thing. Huh? Gallup executed a survey, I think, not so long ago, 1 or 2 years ago, right? So they saw the older you are, the more inclined you are to support Israel. I mean, they were in like 20 countries or so, yeah? And the younger the people get, the more they support Palestine, yeah? Has, of course, to do with social media, which is hard to control, yeah? And news, I mean, this live streamed, and I don't want to go into semantics. I had a couple of academics on my channel discussing, is what Israel is doing now in Gaza a genocide or not? Yeah, but that's semantics. Yeah, Israel is killing a lot of people. These pictures get out and influence the people in the West.
Yes. What I personally criticize a little bit is that if you use those labels like genocide or apartheid, not that it's not apartheid, that it's not genocide, but then the discussion is deviated to whether or not it is fulfilling the definition of genocide of apartheid. So if you kill a lot, mass killing is perhaps the same as genocide, but it's not a label. And discrimination, ethnic discrimination is perhaps the same as apartheid, but then you don't have this issue of deviating attention to whether or not, so this very often happens. If you say, well, they are, the people in Palestinians in the prison are systematically tortured, then it's not about torture, but it's about whether or not it's systematic, for instance. So that's why I was asked when I gave a lecture to a university, is it apartheid? It's different. It's different from South Africa, where you could see by the color of a person whether or not he's white or black, so to say. But in Israel, it's different because Arabs and Jews, at least certain categories of Arabs and Jews, they look very, very much the same. And so it's different. It's not the same, but the system, discrimination is very similar. Because you cannot see if someone is a Jew, or you cannot see if someone is an Arab, although I think you can often see if someone is a Jew. I can give you an example. And it's not general, it doesn't apply always. I was walking with a friend in Aleppo, and I saw a person. I asked my friend, is that a Jew? He said, yes. How do you see it? I can see it from the way he's walking. And but that is, of course, not applicable to all Jews, of course. But in general, you can see from gestures that people, some look different than from others. It's quite normal. It has nothing to do with racism, but some people walk different than others. Some people have different gestures. Some people have different voices than others. That's where you have been born with, or what, because of what you hear or what you imitate.
It's a challenge in Israel, because basically they substituted one Arab population, yeah, the Palestinians, with another Arab population, the Jews from other Arab countries, because Israel needed people. Yeah? One of those was Professor Avi Schleim, which I interviewed, and he spoke about how Israel actually tried by conducting terror campaigns in Egypt, the so-called Lavon affair. I'm sure you're aware of it.
Yes.
But also in Baghdad, where Professor Avi Schleim is from. Yeah.
Yes.
So they substituted this group with that group, which is culturally very, very similar. I don't want to say the same, but very. So this is an oxymoron that I do not really understand.
What was very interesting about the Jews of Iraq, who have been there for more than 2,000 years, if the history books, or if history is correct. They were part of Mesopotamian society. They were very authentic. You can, of course, hear from their dialect whether he's Jewish or not. But in general, they were for Baghdad, they were about 30% of the population of Baghdad. They were Jews. They even had a finance minister who was Jewish. Hussein was his name. And they pronounce, well, they are, in a way, you could say, are they Jewish Arabs or are they Arab Jews? In any case, when I was at the University of Amsterdam, where I worked also as a student, I had to find for my professor a certain passage, a certain part in a book by John Kimche. It was about the Jews in Baghdad, in Iraq, and he wrote that when the fighting was going on in Palestine, it was at its peak. The Jews in Baghdad, they were on Sabbath, they were walking in their most beautiful clothes, just as in London and elsewhere, and that not one window was broken, and that they were peaceful. But I couldn't find this part which my professor was looking for, and then I discovered I had the second edition of the book. So I went and finally found the first edition, and there I found it. But he removed it because, of course, later on it didn't fit into his, what do you call it, into his
narrative.
So he removed it. So we wrote to him, and he said, well, I don't know how it disappeared, but I mean, if you have written a book and you know something about print, then you know that there's not a certain part of a page which suddenly disappears. So the Jews were really intimidated and provoked into leaving, because the narrative of the Israelis is always that, yes, the Arabs attacked us and they wanted to get rid of the Jews. No, all this happened only after the establishment of Israel and not before. Of course, there were certain issues also in Iraq, the Farhud, they call it. There was also some outbursts of against the Jews, but it had usually nothing to do with them being Jewish, but they were perceived by the population as cooperating with the British colonizer, and that's why they attacked them at a certain stage. Like also the Assyrians, they were massacred to a certain. This not because they were Assyrians, but because the Assyrians cooperated with or they would say collaborated with the colonizers. And so this is the Israelis. Ben Gurion, he wanted a lot of Jews because they were in a minority, and also in this so-called partition plan in the part which was a recommendation. It was not a Security Council. There was a even in the part which was supposed to be Israel, the Arabs were also in the majority. So, but the case of the Iraqi Jews is a very interesting case. And also another point is that the Jews from Europe, they were dominant, and they would consider the Jews from the Arab countries as backward. So, yes. So the Hebrew, it has various sounds like Arabic, like the Ain or the Ha or other sounds. So for the Arab Jews, for the people from the Arab world, it was no problem because they spoke Arabic. So in what was supposed to be authentic Hebrew, they would pronounce it in is supposed to be the correct way. But the Jews from Europe, they could not pronounce it. They would not even the ra, the resh in Hebrew. So everything is with the ra. So but if the Jews from Iraq and other parts of the Arab world would pronounce it what I would call the correct way, they would show themselves to be from so-called Arab backward countries. So they imitated the Jews from Europe, and it was a dead language. And the interesting thing is, if you revive a language, but your mother tongue is not from that language, but from a different group, not from a Semitic language, but for instance Yiddish, which is a European medieval German, this influences the way you revive a language. It is inevitable. So that's why now most people, at least the Jews in Israel, they speak this type of Hebrew. But if you hear, for instance, the Palestinians speaking Hebrew, they will usually speak so-called better Hebrew as far as the pronunciation is concerned, like the Iraqis.
I would like to circle back to Baghdad for 1 second, just to underline the fact, yeah, exactly like you said, the Jews lived there without any problems, and then according to Avi Schleim, the problem started when Israel attacked Jews living in both Egypt and Iraq to scare them into migrating to Israel. And then of course there's a whole story with a secret deal behind the scenes between Israel, also Ben Gurion, and Iraq for the property of the refugees. Yeah, they had this 1 year limit, and so I'm sure you know about that.
Yes. So this recompensation, in German Wiedergutmachung, they refused to. So what is interesting about the recent decision of the ICG is that they also say that the Palestinians should be recompensated for the damage which has been done to them. And I think this refers only to the occupied territories of 1967, but you could also apply it to the war of 1948 and the expulsion of some 700,000 plus Palestinians and the destruction of Palestinian villages. So this
450.
Yes, if not more. So this theory about the Jews from Baghdad have not been compensated, so then we don't have to compensate the Palestinians. You have also to take into account the sequence of events, what came first and what has been caused by earlier events. So, as you mentioned, the Jews in Baghdad were living relatively well, and we have very rich people, but also very poor people. But it only started with the establishment of Israel, and that applies also to other countries. Of course, you have always discrimination in various societies, but not in the sense of modern sense that, of course, let's say in the early Islamic society, you had the Zimmis, so one could drive a horse, and another could ride a donkey, and so on. Of course, but it's not in the sense of the modern discrimination. It was not in that sense. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, what Israel accuses others from is doing itself multiple. They are discriminate. The Arabs can choose. They can participate in the elections in Israel, but for the rest, they have lesser rights. And even now, the Arab language is now second place. When I visited Jerusalem for the first time in 1964, you would have the beautiful tiles, Palestinian tiles, with names of streets. On top, it would be the Arabic and then English, and below there would be Hebrew. But now it is Hebrew on top, and in many cases, the Arabic text is, what do you call it, painted over with black paint.
Mm. It always struck me, and I know I'm getting on very thin ice to make this comparison here, but it always struck me how a people who suffered through a Holocaust can afflict that type of violence that we see in Gaza now on another people, and not for defense. This is no longer an argument for me, right? Because Israel never faced a substantial threat from the Palestinians. Yeah, but if we compare the images that are coming out now from Gaza right now with the black and white images, even from concentration camps, if you take away the color from the images today, you wouldn't know which is which. The
Yes.
starved babies, I mean, it's just incredible. How can this happen? A people that went through so much suffering, afflicting similar, again, semantics. Don't hang me on the cross for comparing, which I don't. I don't compare the Holocaust with Gaza, but still, the images are eerily similar.
Well, perhaps it's just because of their history that they do this. It is one of the elements. But concerning the threat, if you carry out war crimes, then of course you will be threatened, because there will always be this issue of accountability. So that is in fact the whole history of this conflict. They are being threatened because they have expelled other people from their own country. I remember, perhaps a side issue, when General Sharon was entering Lebanon in 1982, when the Israelis would advance, then they would be shot at, of course. And they would say, well, I have to defend myself because I'm being shot at. So that this went on until they were in Beirut. So of course, they are threatened, but their life is not at stake. In the sense, is of course people resist, but if you can deduct from the fact that Israel has been able to bomb without any repercussions Egypt, Tunisia, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and now also Yemen, I don't think they are very much threatened. But by all these bombardments, there is an implicit threat, because there may one day be a kind of settlement of accounts. So therefore, my view is that they will never have safety except if they make peace. And for making peace, they must have some concessions. Even now, the Arabs have got used to Israel as an existence, as an entity of before 1967. So even if the Arabs would accept, which they already for a long time accepted, the Israel within the border of 67, then still you have the issue of the expulsion of the Palestinians in 1948. But that would be a settlement, which there will never be a just settlement, but it would be a settlement. But they refuse because they want the whole of Palestine. They would even want more, but they will be threatened because they want to disappropriate, and they are disappropriated, and have disappropriated people of Palestine, like what has been going on in the West Bank and in Gaza for tens of years. I remember when I was in the beginning of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, 1975, then there would be a complaint that the Israelis, they would extend their settlements. But they would say, Peres would say, well, it's not expansion, but a thickening. So inside the perimeters of the settlements, we have more settlers. But in general, gradually they went on and went on. I mean, there has been a long time discussion about this so-called formula of the two-state solution. I think the Israelis never have wanted it. And certainly not under Likud. When Likud came to power in 1978, then they're in their program, it says that the whole of Palestine, they call it Eretz Israel, it is ours, it's for the Jews. I remember I visited Begin with our Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Begin said, how can you occupy something which is already your own? This is their theory. It's the man from White Russia or Poland, he says, this is mine. And so therefore the International Court of Justice, they gave a clear picture that there's not a negotiation about how much Israel should withdraw from the occupied territories of 1967. No, they should withdraw from it. I mean, in fact, it's not negotiable. They should withdraw from the settlements. I mean, as fast as possible. I can tell you that they can do it in a day. They can walk, take a bus, or take a car, and then they can go to the what we call Israel proper. But they're not going to do it because they can get away with it as long as the United States keeps supporting them, and they keep supporting them because a president or a presidential candidate will not be chosen if he doesn't support Israel. So whether it's Republican or Democrat, it's the same. I mean, even now, today, the 23rd of July, the Prime Minister Netanyahu is visiting the United States, and he's talking, the man who is being on the wanted list in other countries as a war criminal is going to address the American political establishment. And maybe they will rise up and applaud for him.
Standing ovation.
Yes.
Yeah. Two-state solution, you just mentioned it, yeah? So we know from Ben-Gurion's letters to his son that Ben-Gurion from that time on already never intended to have a two-state solution. Yeah? He said, he wrote in his letters that he accepted the partition, meaning the two-state solution, only as a means to an end, as a means to get the greater Israel, which is everything. Yeah. Yes. And we had consecutive politicians and governments in the same directions. The actions in the West Bank, Professor Omar Bartov told me, if you would by any miracle have let's say, sane politician in Israel, and this politician would want to have a just peace, especially in the West Bank, that would cause civil war, right? Because Ben-Gvir now armed the settlers to the teeth. Yes. Right.
So there is not going to be peace unless Israel is being forced. But who is the only party which can force Israel is the United States. Of course, there could be sanctions, like, for instance, against Russia or like against Syria. For instance, it would be simple if Europe would freeze the EU association agreement. The second paragraph of which says that human rights should be respected, which is already enough reason for this agreement to refuse. No money traffic, money transfers, no weapons, and so on. It would hurt Israel. But the most important thing is, of course, the United States. They say, and Netanyahu will say, that we are the most important ally of the United States and the West in the Middle East. But this ally is causing a lot of not only problems, it's causing a lot of war. So, for instance, concerning Iran, they are very eager to bomb Iran. But let's say, because Iran, with the argument that Iran is producing, has the ability to produce nuclear weapons. But nobody is talking about the Israeli nuclear weapons, which are the argument for other countries to have nuclear weapons as well. So, for instance, President Hosni Mubarak at the time wanted a mass destruction-free zone in the Middle East. Well, the Israelis don't want that, of course, because they would have to give up their nuclear weapons. So let's say the Israelis are having now relations with the United Arab Emirates, with Bahrain. That would be strategically important for Israel against Iran. But is it also advantageous for those Gulf countries? I think the contrary, because if Israel attacks Iran, the first thing which Iran may do is retaliate against the allies of Iran, with the allies of Israel, by just bombarding their oil installations and their water desalination, and then these countries are out of order completely. So you could also say, having these relations with Israel without having peace is in a way a kiss of death, because it may end up that those Gulf countries are not more secure, but less secure.
Israel bombed what was it, Iranian embassy, right, in Syria?
Yes.
Yeah, hoping to draw the U.S. into a war against Iran. I mean, this is, if you think about this, yeah. I mean, we have already wars in Europe here, Ukraine, Russia, right? As if that's not enough. Then we have the whole Gaza conflict, yeah. Not to mention all the wars which happen now in the background, yeah.
Yes.
I mean, Yemen was bombed for what? For 10 years, yeah.
Yes.
By Saudi Arabia and yeah. And still, there are forces who promote even more wars, yeah.
So if you will look at Iran, the background to the increase of influence of Iran in the Middle East is the United States. By toppling the regime of Saddam Hussein, they gave the red carpet treatment to Iran. So since then, Iran has increased its influence in Iraq enormously. It has increased its influence in Syria enormously, in Lebanon, and also in Yemen. And I think that it's not that Iran, let's say if you take Yemen, it was not eager to expand its influence in Yemen, but it was provided opportunity to expand its influence. So that is normal. I think in politics, the power vacuum, it's a concept which theoretically there, but if there is a vacuum, it's immediately filled up so that the vacuum ceases to exist. And this is what happened. And the Americans, even though they have very good experts on Iraq or other countries, in those countries, in the United States, but it also applies to many other countries, politicians don't listen to the advice of experts if it doesn't suit them politically. You also have the issue of so-called democracy. Western countries want to have democracy in other countries, for instance, in Arab countries, but it means in practice that we want you to have democracy, but then you must do exactly what we say. So, for instance, in Algeria, you had the Front Islamique, the Islamic Front. They won the elections, but that was not the intention, of course. In Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood did win, but that was not. They accepted it, but it didn't last for a very long time. The countries which intervened in Syria, for instance, the argument was that was good for democracy, but countries which don't have democracy themselves, they only intervene in other countries for strategic reasons, not because they feel pity for the population, which is usually enormously suffering from wars, which happens until today. So it's mainly for strategic reasons, particularly also the United States. They don't care about the suffering of the Palestinians. They care about their strategic interests. And they think that Israel is a good ally, but Israel is dealing as it likes, whether the United States wants it or not.
Again, lots of things to unpack. Yeah. So if you talk about cause and effect of American actions, yeah, and we take this in the context of Iran, yeah, I mean Mossadegh was democratically elected.
Exactly.
Then Kermit Roosevelt, the grandson of the former president, I have his memoir somewhere behind me, boasts quite openly how the CIA overthrew the government,
Yes.
which resulted in the Shah, which resulted in the regime that we're having today. So the
Yes.
root cause,
Yes.
goes back to the US.
Like also the military coups in Syria in 1949. I think Miles Copeland, The Game of Nations, he wrote about it, but it's also probably other sources. How the Americans, caused these coups, and these military coups are in fact a curse for the situation, because the military, they start with so-called ideals, at least some of them, but once they're in power, the main aim is to stay in power. Well, whatever. So you could call it the organizational elite, the group which is better organized than others, and therefore is able to stay in power for decades, if not longer.
And to get the population, us, Western population, global population, into these wars, there's manipulation. And I'm sure you know the iconic image from Colin Powell testifying at the UN, where he has this
Yes.
glass tube with this
Yeah.
white powder. Do you know what was in this powder? Do
No.
you know what was?
No.
I can tell you because I interviewed Colin Powell's chief of staff, Colonel Larry Wilkerson, and he told me it was salt.
Salt. Yes. The question is still, was Colin Powell being lied to, or was he aware of the lies? Because you probably also have seen the interview of retired General Wesley, who said he visited the Ministry of Defense, Pentagon, and there they said, we're going to topple 7 countries, the regimes. And then it was, I think, Afghanistan, Syria, Lebanon, Somalia, Libya, and so on. 7 countries. So they said, why? Well, we don't know. But so this idea is, in a way, you could say it's ridiculous, but it is extremely, well, let's say criminal, because it's not toppling a regime. If you want to topple a regime, you must be quite sure, if not fully sure, of what's going to happen afterwards. It is like starting a war is easy, but stopping it is much more difficult. People think often that if a regime has been removed, then paradise will break out. But that's, of course, not the case. So you must, if you have ideas, you must also be able to formulate and describe the road to that aim, how you achieve it, the middle way, the way towards it. But that's not usually the case. And the Americans have thought that if they would topple the regime of Saddam Hussein, then they would be very popular, but they were not at all popular. And I leave out of our discussion now all the war crimes they committed themselves. So like Julian Assange, he was for a long time prosecuted and imprisoned and so on, whereas the people who committed the crimes, they're giving lectures and so on, they're free. And it's a ridiculous, shameful situation, of course.
There was, of course, the period between the first Gulf War and the second Gulf War, where our sanction, the Western sanction, caused the death of 500,000 Iraqi children.
Yes.
And I saw Madeleine Albright on TV stating she found it justified. And then the Americans think, because you said they have smart people understanding the situation, and then the Americans think they go in a second time, topple the government, and they will be, greeted with open arms and flags. Yeah.
Well, indeed, Albright said it was worth it. Later on, she perhaps, because there were more children killed than in Hiroshima, later on she withdrew it, but her reflex was it was worth it. And that was also what the Americans argued with the toppling of President Saddam Hussein and his regime. Just imagine this was 2003, and we are now 21 years later on, and in the meantime, the situation hasn't improved at all. Of course, Saddam Hussein did two huge mistakes, which one was the attack of Iran, and the second was the attack and occupation of Kuwait. My theory is that if President Saddam Hussein would not have invaded Iran, and by the way, the Iran didn't fulfill what was agreed upon in the Algiers Treaty of '79 with Vice President Saddam Hussein and the Shah of Iran, but they didn't fulfill it. But if he would have left it as it was, perhaps the Islamic Revolution would have been less strong. It gave a kind of, what do you call it, a kind of stimulation of the Iranian Revolution, this war, to make it stronger. Because, well, they were occupied by it was a very, very bad decision. Also, concerning Kuwait, one of the reasons was that Kuwait didn't fulfill its obligations concerning the production of oil. But this was one of the big mistakes of, let's say, this dictator, that he could not evaluate what, if everyone inside the country would have to agree with him, it didn't mean that he would get away with it outside his country. So let's say if he would meet President Mubarak in Cairo, it would be a different conversation, a different effect than if the same situation would take place between these two leaders inside Baghdad.
But, but was he not told by the Americans, because Saddam Hussein asked the Americans, if I attack Kuwait, what will you do? And he was told by the American, it was a female...
April Glaspie.
Yeah, please.
Well, I think this was wrong. In the first place, April Glaspie didn't know that she was going to visit the president. Because at that time already the president didn't receive ambassadors for presentation of credentials. This was to his deputy, Izzat Ibrahim. So she was told, you're going to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. And then there she changed cars and went to the president. She was fully unprepared. So the only thing she could say explain was the American policy. American policy. So I think she was made the scapegoat. She didn't say that you can interfere whatever you like. She didn't give the green light to the occupation of Kuwait. Perhaps the Iraqis may have interpreted it that way, but that was not what she said. So I know her very well. We presented credentials to Vice Chairman of the Revolutionary Command Council, Izzat Ibrahim, the same day. And she was really an expert, very well known, had a lot of expertise concerning the region, which doesn't apply to all American ambassadors, because some of them are what I would call Kentucky Fried Chicken ambassadors. When they have contributed a lot of money, they are appointed ambassador. And in a certain way, for the receiving country, that may be even better, because, with due respect, but the Kentucky Fried Chicken ambassador, he has direct access to the President of the United States, whereas an ambassador like April Glaspie, an expert, does not have that expert because she didn't contribute to the elections. So I think this was wrongly portrayed and wrongly interpreted. And even I'm not sure whether the Iraqis, whether their plans were to occupy it from the beginning, Kuwait, or because it was a border conflict, actually. Nobody I know of was expecting that they were going to occupy the whole of Kuwait. Even though under President Qasem, Iraq, he claimed Kuwait as one of the provinces of, this was in 1961, I think. I may be wrong concerning the year. And then the British intervened. But the the Ba'athist regime never claimed it, although I was later told that the fact that we didn't claim it didn't mean that we didn't claim it, if you know what I mean. If it did not explicitly. So it was I'm not sure even whether they intended to occupy the whole of the country when they started. I don't know. But within a few days they had, or within one day, within a very short time, they occupied the whole of Kuwait. It was a disaster for Kuwait, of course, but also for the Iraqis themselves because of the repercussions. And even in 1991, Saddam Hussein, he could have withdrawn from Kuwait with all his weapons intact, even the supposedly present weapons of mass destruction, but he didn't. So this was a huge mistake. In general, you could say that intervention in other countries without being threatened, it's a big mistake. And this has happened more than once.
Some argue he made a third mistake, and that's that he started to sell oil against something else than US dollars, which was undermining the petrodollar. And that's coincidentally something that he has in common with Libya's Gaddafi, of course. Yeah, he also started to sell oil against something else, right?
Yes, that could be. That could be. But I think the most explicit thing is that he felt that the other side didn't stick to agreements, and he warned. I think in the case of Iran, they had written 62 notes, verbals to the Iranians. You should withdraw from some minor territories, and then in the end he hit them. And the same applied to Kuwait, although it was a very disastrous decision for the countries attacked and for the country which attacked.
Ambassador, do you still have time to discuss October the 7th a little bit?
Yes, of course.
Yeah. So the one thing that stuck in my mind from the first 1, 2, 3 weeks when we talk about October the 7th is that basically any interview around the world, the first question that they asked was, do you condemn Hamas? As if October the 7th had been falling out of the blue sky. And even UN General Secretary Guterres was fiercely attacked by the Israel ambassador to the UN for stating October the 7th did not occur in a vacuum. So what's your view on this situation?
Well, this is a technique. It's called, you might call it the declaratory policy. You have to declare something. And then by declaring that the, I think also the European, the head of the foreign policy, he was asked, is Hamas a terrorist organization? And then, yes, of course. And then the next question, is Israel committing terror? Well, this has to be decided by a court. So here you see the double standard. So, of course, it was, in the first place, occupation, tens of years, cutting off Gaza. I'm not talking about the West Bank where similar things were happening. So it was only natural that after so many years there will be a kind of reaction. And I think that the main thing was that, but let's say, so what the politicians also in the Netherlands, their reaction was no, but. You may not discuss what happened before because it's a terrorist organization, terrible, and you have to condemn it. Well, you can condemn it, of course, but you have to condemn them also, all the things which happened before. Not one event, not 10 events, thousands of events. So, and I think my analysis would be that the main aim of Gaza, of the Hamas, was to get Palestine on the agenda, because they could never have won. They have not the slightest chance to win from Israel. They don't threaten the existence of Israel, but they threaten they may carry out an attack, which they did with more than 1,000 dead. But they never had the slightest chance to threaten the existence of Israel. So they succeeded in having Palestine on the agenda, but at a terrible cost. And I don't know, there's no defense at all, but I don't know how they would otherwise have gotten Palestine on the political agenda, of the world agenda, of the Security Council, because this is the issue. Israel just wants to continue and occupy these territories and keep them and gradually expel all Palestinians. And they get away with it. They got away with it. The main thing why Israel is now being criticized is because of its own behavior, of its disproportional behavior every day, daily. So the issue of the most politicians is, well, you first have to condemn the 7th of October. Yes, okay, you can condemn it, but not outside the framework of what is happening in the context of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict or the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's normal, and you should blame all those politicians who have never been wanting to do anything about it, even though everything was visible. Nowadays, of course, much more than in the past, because now you can see every minute, every day, you can see tens of more films of what is happening. So it's a phenomenon in European countries and in other countries that you have a declaration, so you condemn something. But then what happens? If after having condemned it, then you go on as usual, tens of years. You don't have to have any political consequence. In one case, Russia, for instance, you have sanctions, but when it is about Israel, no sanctions. Not even, you may even criticize one side and not the other.
I have a statement here. I prepared it from Ursula von der Leyen. Yeah, she says Russia attacks against civilian infrastructure, especially electricity, are war crimes. Cutting off men, women, and children of water, electricity, and heater. These are acts of pure terror. Yeah, of course, we don't hear similar statements when related to Israel. Yeah?
No, and also she had a speech about the Israelis making the desert bloom, all these kinds of cliches, the Israeli cliches. For Germany is a special case because they have this terrible history about the Jews, and I think they compensate this by not wanting to criticize anything Jewish or anything Zionist or Israeli. But in fact, what is in my view the case, they were on the wrong side of history, and now they are again on the wrong side of history because they're not it is very sensitive. I was in Germany, I was ambassador there for almost 7 years, and this subject was undiscussable. Any criticism of Israel, they could not condone it. So, von der Leyen, she does exactly the same thing. It's all political cliches. It is as if the Israelis would have written her speech, making the desert bloom. Yes, of course, but you need water from it, and where does the water come from, and so on. It comes from where, and what is the dividing of water? How deep can you go into the ground as an Israeli? A Jewish Israeli should add, or as a Palestinian. So who has swimming pools in the West Bank and who has not? So this is really unbelievable about after so many years, the conflict in the open. Even such cliches are being mentioned, and she has been chosen again. So for the Germans, it's even more sensitive than others. But also in Germany, you will have a lot of immigrants who think about it completely differently. And so this double standards, I mean, it's objective standards. It's a war crime or it's not a war crime. It is disproportional or not, it's proportional or not proportional. But this is also a point, what is the proportional? If it is proportional to have 1 to 40 victims, which means that if you would have 40,000 Palestinian victims, if it would be the other way around, it would be 1.6 million victims. Then it's, of course, disproportional. But here, it's again, we are discussing, do you have a label on it? What is proportional? Then you can talk about proportional. But in the meantime, people get killed in the thousands. Every day, 100 people are being killed, if not more. And then I'm not talking about the wounded and about the effects of, let's say, the hunger. You know, of course, that if someone before you get 4 years old, what you then miss as, let's say, what you eat, the first years are very important. So if you have very little to eat, hunger, you miss all kinds of essentials the first 4 years. You can eat afterwards as much as you like, but you can never recover it, what you missed in the first time. And then I'm not talking about the pollution of the water or illnesses breaking out and so on. The whole world is looking at it, but not doing anything, I would say.
The U.S. Ambassador Just Friedman told me that he thinks the Nazis had, and that's his words, yeah, that he thinks the Nazis had more shame than Israelis because at least they tried to hide their crimes, right?
Yes. Well, no, the point is that it is all in the open. And it's a kind of intimidation that if you do anything in the open, you should shut your mouth. You shouldn't talk about it. I mean, they don't have any intention to hide. They don't have any inclination to be ashamed. No.
On the contrary.
On the contrary.
Yeah.
And I heard a parliamentarian, an Israeli parliamentarian, Jewish parliamentarian. She said that after 80 years, the Israelis will be proud of what we did. And but if you don't correct them and criticize them, and more than criticize them, of course, because a declaration is not enough. You also have to impose sanctions. As long as they think they can get away with it, they will continue to do so. And nobody is forbidding them from doing anything, from doing what they're doing.
Yeah, and they're using manipulation and propaganda to achieve this goal. And one key element when we talk about October the 7th was the story about the 40 babies, right?
Oh, yes, and then it's like in Kuwait when they were
exactly
they were talking about this
incubators, babies.
Incubators.
Yeah.
But the point is that once you have told this, that even if you prove that it's not true, it will keep hanging it will remain in the minds. There must be like the proverb, where there's smoke, there's fire.
Yeah, but now you have to explain it. We have to. The audience may not know what happened in Kuwait with the incubator babies.
So in Kuwait, there was the daughter of a Kuwaiti diplomat. She was crying in front of television and said, well, the Iraqis, and I should add that this was, of course, a terrible occupation, but she said they took off the babies from the incubator, so the babies died.
She said they smashed them on the ground.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's like the beheaded babies. You think that even if you attack, and you know that at any moment you have confrontation with the Israelis, who are much stronger. This is the logical thing. Do you have any time to behead a baby? But it's still, I think President Biden even repeated it after it was. So this is stick in the minds of people. Once you have planted the seed, it will remain there.
Yeah.
And that is, and then of course the Israelis have their allies. They have their Jewish communities in general who are supporting them and who are part of the countries they are living in, whereas the Palestinians or the Arabs don't have that factor, at least not that much. So I've always wondered why not rich Arab countries didn't hire expensive bureaus for propaganda and to try to achieve something similar.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Just to elaborate, so the story from the incubator babies in Kuwait was actually a story from an American PR company. So there was nothing spontaneous about this story.
Oh, yeah.
And the story from the 40 babies, which President Biden repeated a couple of times, which is completely debunked. I saw an interview with the, how should I call him, soldier? No, it's not a soldier. It was from such an side organization, I think, who collects body parts or so in Israel. And this guy was interviewed, and the interviewer then said, okay, I know these are graphic images. We cannot show them on TV, but can you show me the picture that you said you have on your telephone from those 40 babies? Yeah. And he indeed pulled out his phone, he showed him, and then the reporter said, well, look, I don't see any babies here. Yeah, well, that's a piece of meat. You never know how old they are, if it's young or old or whatever, yeah? So that's the source of information that came to the American president, which was repeated by him, was then debunked, yeah? But as you said, the damage is done. So not many, I think this still is in the people's mind, that they killed 40 babies, which is absolutely nonsense.
And we have a kind of saying that if you keep lying enough, then the person who tells the lies starts in a certain moment to believe in his lies or her lies, him or herself.
Yeah, and I can tell you, I'm a behavior analyst. I can explain the psychological mechanisms, yeah, cognitive biases that make that happen. It's just incredible. Yeah.
Yes.
Dear Ambassador, there is so much else we could discuss, but for the purpose of today's interview, is there any topic that's close to your heart that we still could cover?
Well, I already mentioned that military intervention in a country which is not threatening you usually brings disaster. So Iraq was not threatening the United States. You remember that they said, well, they could attack us with master structures within a short time. It was not true. Iraq was not threatening the United States nor Britain. They intervened. It was a disaster. The intervention in Afghanistan, whether it was the United States or it was the Soviet Union or the British in the past or the Persians in the past, it all ended up in a disaster. The intervention in Syria has become a disaster for the people. The intervention in Libya, all those kinds of so this is an element which I think is very important, that you can support something, but you must know what you can expect from it. So also this Arab Spring has been portrayed as a fantastic movement. Now, after some 13 years, people start to see that it was not all that justified. But I've mentioned that in a month after it started or within the first year, but people didn't. They would react by saying, well, then you are pro this regime or pro that regime. Like if you criticize the Israeli, then they frame you as being pro Hamas or something like that. I think this is an issue which has happened in the Middle East time and again, and it didn't bring anything positive. No, it brought disaster. And what is another element is that politicians don't learn from it. And then in democracies, politicians are generally acting on basis of electoral feelings, prospects. And this is the day-to-day politics, not the long-term vision. So I think politicians would have to listen more to experts. Experts can also have their political inclinations. I don't deny that. But this is what I'm missing. Whether it's the United States or the Western Europe. And also, I think several wars could have been prevented if at an earlier stage, wiser decisions would have been made.
Two little things still, Ambassador. So first of all, in all your years in the Middle East, and this is a personal question, yeah, for you personally, not the impact that it had, not on a political level, yeah, what was the key event, happening, situation, experience for you as person, not as ambassador?
Well, it cannot be
I know there's a
disconnected
lot.
from it.
I know there's a lot. Yeah.
But I have several events. Well, the Israeli invasion in 1982, the taking of hostages in Iraq in 1990, and then in Indonesia, our colonial history and the apologies for what we did in the past. These are three events. Just I take them out as not really at random, but they have to do with my function. So I had the luck to serve in all these countries. Well, these are the, let's say, highlights, but there are many, many highlights. And at the personal level, I'm very grateful that I had the opportunity to work in all those countries, to learn the language, to learn the people, to get to know them better. And this was really a personal enrichment. And I can call myself a very happy person too, and I'm very satisfied which I could do and have done, which I was also given the opportunity to do, and which I took the opportunity to do, to make what I thought was the best of it. So I'm very glad. And also, after my retirement, I still had this position as Special Envoy for Syria, where I did also my best to carry out to convey our official policy, to convey to the Syrian opposition and others what I personally thought was the best analysis and the best way of doing. So I'm very glad I could do all those things. That's my personal thing.
And concluding, and I know you don't have a crystal ball, yeah, but where do you think the whole situation in the Middle East in general and Israel-Palestine in particular will go in the next, I don't know, half year, 5 years, whatever?
I think it will remain war. And as long as the Israelis are not forced into making peace, and it is in our, and when I say our, in the whole world's interest that they are forced to make peace, there will be no peace, and there will further be destabilization. And so, in fact, the foreign intervention. And in a way, the establishment of Israel is a type of foreign intervention as well, because it was imposed on the people living there. So the prospect is that there's not going to be peace with the political constellation as we have it now in the United States, whether it's Republicans or Democrats, it's the same. So this is the prospects, unless people are wise enough to say, well, the aim is to have peace, really peace, even if it's an unjust peace. It's better to have an unjust peace than to have war. The time is going to, it is going to continue, very unfortunately, in the same way. So I can only hope, perhaps naively, but that the politicians will become more wisely and really act in our own interest. Our own interest is peace there. And our constitution, in the Dutch constitution, Article 90 says that we have to promote peace. And this is one of these discussions which is going on in the Netherlands between officials who work for the government. They protest against the government, not because they side with this party or that party, but because they see that the government is violating, in fact, our own constitution by its behavior, which is not promoting peace. So officials outside the ministries, they protest in order to encourage or to try to get the government to act according to its own principles, which it doesn't do. Because ministers have to, when they are sworn in, they swear on the Constitution. So in fact, they violate the constitution which they have been sworn in on.
On that note, Ambassador, on that not too optimistic note, let's just say, I really appreciate the time you allowed me to spend with you. I wish you all the best, and you definitely will hear from me. You will definitely hear from me again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.